I'm Sara Bryant, I'm a Master Gardener, and I've been really working with native plants for the past several years. I got inspired by Doug Tallamy, who I will talk a little bit about. I've got a couple of his books up here that if you haven't read these, they're easy reading. They're in the library. These are really, I was interested in native plants, but these books are really what got me inspired and into doing more gardening with native plants. How many of you are already gardening with native plants? Everybody but you.
I may have one or two.
You may have one or two. Okay. Well, they're not so easy to find, which is one of the things about why bother, because they are hard to find. You won't find them at Walmart or at the hardware store. But you have to go out looking for them, so that is an issue. So let's start with some definitions of native plants. Are those that were present on the North American continent prior to the the European settlers coming into North America. We have about 18,000 native plants, and 25% are at risk of extinction. So putting those back in the environment is important. Now, non-native plants are those who have plants that have been brought to the North American continent from other continents. 30,000 non-native plants have been introduced since the settlement of Jamestown, which I looked it up, is 1607, and was the first English settlement in North America. 6,500 have survived, and about 3,300 of them are invasive. Now, I mention invasive plants because they are the enemies of our native plants. Most of them have been introduced through the horticulture industry and to use as ornamentals. And they've contributed to the decline of 42% of our endangered and plant species. So I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive plants because they are the enemy of one of the enemies of our native plants. And they become invasive because they outperform. They're thugs, they're bullies. They outperform our native plants and take up resources that these plants would have, such as habitat, sunlight, nutrients from the soil, and water. Over $100 billion is spent annually in the United States to control invasive plants, so it's a huge problem. And you don't have to be in the south, but about 15 minutes to see this situation. And you can see the kudzu completely blocks out the sunlight for these trees. So if any plant were to germinate, it wouldn't last very long because it would have no sunlight. So the big rationale for gardening with native plants has to do with insects, and we're kind of an insect-phobic society. I don't know how much money is spent a year in this country in killing insects, which mostly people they just don't like them, so they kill them. So we need to support our insects because they are what, they in turn support our birds, amphibians, our reptiles, and mammals, and we are one of the mammals that these insects are supporting. Another rationale for planting native plants is that these plants are more likely to survive because they're suited to our environment. They are from this environment, and this is where they're good at growing. Another big thing is that they provide for the local specialist insects as well as generalist insects. And I'm going to define those in just a minute. And native plants will never become invasive. The value of native plants, they support our insect species and populations. Plant life is dependent on insects for pollination. Animal life is dependent on insects for food. And animal life is dependent on the plants that on the native plants and the plants that the insects pollinate. Overhill Gardens down in Von Orr, Tennessee is a native plant garden, and in their newsletter in October, they said all things we see in nature are ultimately reliant on native plants as their food source, either directly or indirectly. The federal government estimates that 20% of the 20,000 native plants in North America are at risk of extinction. Okay. I'm going to introduce you to a couple of entomologists or insect specialists. One is E.O. Wilson. He died just last year. He was a Harvard entomologist. He wrote 20 books, won 4 Pulitzer prizes, was a very well thought of biologist. And he had a succinct little saying, insects, the little things that run the world. And he expanded on that, saying if insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. I think that's mind-boggling to think that these little insects, which most of our lives have considered to be pests, are so important. The other entomologist is Doug Tallamy, whose books are up here. Doug Tallamy is an entomology professor at the University of Delaware, and according to him, wildlife populations are in decline because the native plants they rely on are disappearing. 3 billion birds were lost in the last 50 years. You may have seen that statistic in the last few years. 2/3 of the Earth's wildlife is gone, 40% of plants face extinction, and 80% of our plants are pollinated by insects. So they're pretty important little critters. They pollinate, now he says 70%, but another resource I saw said that they pollinate 75% of our food crops, flowers, trees, and shrubs. They also break down dead plant and animal material. If you've ever seen a dead log in the woods or a dead carcass of an animal, what is it full of? It's full of insects. So they break those things down and return those nutrients to the soil. Insects are the food source for reptiles, amphibians, birds. Doug Tallamy's graduate students, only graduate students can sit around and count, but they counted the number of caterpillars that the mother chickadees were bringing to the baby, mother and daddy chickadees were bringing to the nest of Carolina chickadees, which we have here in East Tennessee. And it was 4,000 to 6,000 insects before those birds fledged. Now, after they fledged, they continued to feed them, but it's pretty hard to observe them out flying around. So they could only observe them while they were still in the nest. But then caterpillars are very important in the process of making the sun's energy available to the animal world. This was something I'd never thought about, and it really hit me. Photosynthesis occurs when the sun's energy shines on plants and it facilitates photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the production of green plants. Caterpillars come along and eat these green plants. So they essentially are taking the sun's energy through those green plants, digesting it, and then they are being eaten by other animals. So I read, and I can't remember the exact number, but the caterpillars eat many times their weight in green leaves in their lifespan. It seems to me like one caterpillar was like 70 times its weight in green plants. So that just I thought was a pretty amazing statistic about how these caterpillars are so important to moving the sun's energy into the plant world. Keep forgetting I have to do this. Specialist insects and generalist insects. Specialists are those that use only one or a few plants as their food source. And their food can be nectar, pollen, or leaves. 50% of insects are herbivores, so they're eating plants. 90% of the herbivorous insects are specialists. 25% of our native bees are specialists. And these specialist relationships are the norm. The rest of the insects are called generalists, and they can eat a wide variety of things. So they're not going to be as endangered as the specialist insects, because if the plant they need is not available, they're not going to eat, and we know what happens then. So what makes an insect a specialist compared to a generalist? And it has to do with evolution. For thousands and thousands of years, these insects and plants have evolved together. And the specialist insects have developed over time the ability to feed on plants that have physical and chemical deterrents that keep generalists at bay. So the plants don't really want to be eaten, and they have a lot of chemicals in them that prevent some insects from eating them. Now, the plight of the monarch is pretty well known, and I call monarchs the poster child for specialist insects. So the life cycle of the monarch, you have an adult butterfly, it lays an egg, the egg hatches, that's the caterpillar or the larval stage. Then at some point that caterpillar spins a chrysalis or a pupa, and then when it breaks out of the pupa, it's an adult. The caterpillar has to eat milkweed. If the egg is laid on anything other than milkweed, that caterpillar, when it hatches out, can't survive because it doesn't eat anything but milkweed. The epitome of the picky eater. The monarchs migrate. They go to Mexico in the winter and around the area of Mexico City. And in the spring, they start flying back north. So if you think about the map, they fly up through Texas, and then they come up into the south from the Midwest and all the way to southern Canada. It takes 3 or 4 generations of monarchs to get to Canada. So the monarchs that start out don't make it through the entire journey. Along the journey, they're laying eggs. Caterpillars are hatching, and if those female monarchs did not find milkweed to lay their eggs on, then the caterpillars are going to die when they hatch. And this is why monarchs are on the endangered species list. I believe it's an international list. I don't believe they're on the American list of endangered species. The monarch butterfly people who support monarch butterflies have done a great job of getting this information out. And I think they are probably responsible for the big surge in interest in pollinator gardens, because anytime you see anything about a pollinator garden, they always talk about milkweed, which is essential for the butterflies. So every stage of life, the butterfly has to have the appropriate food. Specialist insects require the native plants on which they evolved to survive, and the monarch is the best known example of this situation. The federal government estimates 25% of our 20,000 native plant species are at risk, and that's mostly due to habitat loss. So 50% of the landmass of the planet is used for agriculture. And the reason we have to spend that much of our space on agriculture is obviously to feed people. Last year, a statistic came out that we had crossed the 8 billion population number. The Earth has 8 billion people, and scientists say that the Earth can only support 4 billion people. So I doubt that the percentage of land mass is going to decrease from that 50% for agriculture. And then development plays a big role. Pavement covers enough space to cover the state of Ohio. We have industry housing. We have 40 million acres of lawn in North America. Enough to cover New England. And so those lawn grasses are not native. 78% of the land in the United States is privately owned. So this is a problem that those of us who own property, even a little quarter-acre suburban lot, is important for putting native plants. That number is even higher east of the Mississippi because so much of our federal lands are west of the Mississippi. So let's talk about gardening with native plants, now that you've got the background. So when you're thinking about putting in some native plants, as with any garden plants you want to put in, you need to assess your location. What's the sun situation, sun or shade? What's the moisture situation? Are you on a slope where you've got erosion and more dry conditions to deal with, or are you in a low area that's going to be more likely to be wet? Now, I've included 3 terms because you may see these when you look things up on the internet. You may see these terms, and just so that you are a little bit familiar with them, you probably have to go back and Google it for the definition. But at any rate, mesic means that there's a moderate amount of moisture. Xeric is dry, which would be more desert areas or really very rocky, sandy soil. It's going to be dry. And then hydric is wet soil, bogs and wetlands. Then the soil type's important, whether you have clay, loam, sandy soil, whether you have a lot of organic matter in your soil or not. And then the pH, or the acid level of the soil. And a lot of our native plants are okay in the middle between acid and basic. But there are some that are very picky. Blueberries, for example, are very picky about acid soil. So it's good to have your soil tested and determine exactly what you're dealing with. In site preparation, remove the invasives. Remember, they're going to outcompete your natives, so don't put them in with invasive plants. You need to remove your invasive weeds and grass, and there's several ways of doing that. Herbicides are one way. Black plastic will do it. Takes a long time, and it heats up the soil so much that it kills microbes in the soil. So, in the microbes, we're learning more and more about how the microbes in the soil interact with the roots of our plants. Burning is probably not something we do here in this part of the country. Another way, if you're putting a native plant garden in where you have lawn, is to kill the lawn area you're going to use with herbicides, and then put your plants directly into the dead grass. That dead grass provides some of the benefits of mulch by keeping the ground covered, not having bare soil. pulling the weeds or pulling up the grass disturbs the soil and can affect the, disturbs the soil, and you may be pulling up weed seeds that are under the surface, and so then you exacerbate your weed problem. You want to avoid tilling the soil. Again, you bringing up weed seed, and you are disrupting the composition, the nature of the soil, and that can be bad for the soil. Most of our native plants like less than more fertile soil. So if you add fertilizers, you're just encouraging the roots to stay within a small area where the fertilizer exists, rather than putting roots deep into the ground looking for nutrients on their own. And then soil amendments is the same thing. If you plant a tree and you dig out an area, put in compost and rich dirt, those tree roots, when they get past that and hit the clay, they're not going to want to go anywhere. So you're much better off to plant in the soil that you've got. If your plant doesn't survive, then you need to consider that you put a plant in the wrong spot. And then, do you want to plant seed or do you want to plant plants? So seeds, of course, are more economical, but they're slower to start. A lot of our native flowers, the seed requires what's called cold stratification. That means they have to be in a cold, moist environment for sometimes up to 3 months before they will germinate in a warm environment. And then some of them are not going to bloom the first year. If you do decide to purchase seed, be sure to buy from a reputable dealer. People who buy a package of wildflower seeds from a big box store are likely to get a few native wildflowers, a lot of non-native wildflowers, and a lot of annuals, which are only going to be pretty for 1 year, and you may get some invasives. So on your resource list, which is the last sheet on your last handout, I've put some native plant nurseries, mail order nurseries that are reputable, and I've got some catalogs up here at the front if you want to take a look at those. So be careful what you're buying. When you buy plants, of course, you get a lot more than you do when you start out with a seed, but you're going to pay $8 to $12 for a quart plant. Another option, if you can find them, are plants in plug trays. In the plug trays, the little pots in them are about 2 inches wide. They're about 6 inches deep. So these plants have got good deep roots, and they're much cheaper to buy 32 plants in a plug tray than it is to buy 32 plants in pots. The problem is finding them. Now, one of your resources is Prairie Moon Nursery, and you can mail order plants in plug trays from them, and I'm sure there are others as well. Hopefully nurseries will start realizing that this is a good thing to do. I'm not sure if they will, because I don't know how profitable it would be. They buy them in the plug trays and then transplant them into the bigger pots and then sell them for a lot more. Next is plant nomenclature. If you don't know a little bit about the botanical names, you don't know what you're buying. So they're in Latin. I don't know about you, but I didn't do too well in Latin, but this Latin is a lot more interesting and a lot more useful to me than what I learned in high school. So each plant name has a genus and a species. So I've got Echinacea purpurea up there. The genus is written in block letters, and the species is written in italics. Then there's something called cultivars, which I'll talk about in a minute. They will be written in single quotations after the species. So an example is hydrangea, the genus, arborescens is the species, and Haas halo is the cultivar. I'll talk about those in a minute, so don't be puzzled about what that means. Many of our wildflower species have various common names, so that can be confusing. And a lot of our native and non-native plants have similar names. So you want to be able to differentiate between those. And unfortunately, a lot of the native plants and non-native plants with similar names, the non-native is an invasive. So you certainly don't want to be buying invasives and putting them in. So I've got several examples. One, the beautiful burning bush. That's Euonymus elatus. You can't get prettier fall color than with the burning bush. It's highly invasive. Another one is Euonymus fortunii, which is winter creeper. It's a little, has a little leaf, and you see it climbing up trees, climbing on the ground. It can actually grow to the point, in my neighborhood, there are people who have that cut like a shrub. The native is Euonymus americana, hearts of us into love. Are you familiar with that? It's the middle picture over there. It has a bright pink casing for the seed, and in the fall, that busts open in common parlance, and in it are these bright red seeds. So it's a really pretty plant. Wisteria, we have Japanese and Chinese wisteria locally, which are highly invasive and will grow up in a tree. And I've seen the base of those to be a foot, 2 feet across. They can be huge. So Wisteria floribunda is the Japanese, Wisteria sinensis is the Chinese. We have a native Wisteria, Wisteria frutescens. So when you buy Wisteria, if you don't see both of the words, and if you don't look it up on your phone to make sure that that's the one that's native, you're much more likely to get the invasive one than you are to buy the native. So these little computers that we carry around in our pockets are extremely valuable for more reasons than one. Honeysuckle, we have the Lonicera macchii, or amber honeysuckle, covers our woods, covers our woodlands here in East Tennessee, along with privet. We do have a native one, the yellow flower over on the side. Deerfield Lonicera is a native bush honeysuckle. It's not a very showy flower, but I think the bush honeysuckle they're not really very showy either. Then the honeysuckle vine, I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's Lonicera japonica. And then our native is Lonicera sempervirens, which has either a red or yellow bloom. Sometimes they're orange, much prettier than the invasive honeysuckle. But without seeing the genus and species name, you can't be sure of what you're buying. So there's some keywords that clue you in. If you see japonica or sinensis, you're talking about Japanese or Asian plant, and you want to avoid those. The terms on the right are all terms that are related to North America. So if you see a plant where the species is canadensis, pennsylvanica, tennesseeensis, virginica, virginiana, cherokeeensis, these are North American terms, and you won't find native plants with these names. So those are, and there are lots more. There are lots more that are out there. Now we're going to talk about a straight species versus a cultivar. A straight species is a plant as it's found in nature, the way it is supposed to be. A cultivar is a plant variety that has been genetically altered by human beings to change some aspect of that plant. Oftentimes it's the color of the leaves, the color of the flower, the number of petals the flower has, the size of the plant, the shape of the plant, anything to make it more desirable for people in their yards, in their home landscapes. That's the whole plan. The problem is that we don't know what their benefit to wildlife is. We don't know what their benefit to insects is. And as you now know, insects are one of the main reasons that we need to be gardening with native plants. We do know, though, that red foliage is not identified by an insect as food, so they're not going to eat red foliage. They will eat variegated foliage. And we know that a cultivar that has an increased number of flower petals is not going to have as much pollen. And I'll show you in just a minute why that's the case. All plants of a particular cultivar are genetically identical. So let's say you plant a row of shrubs that are a cultivar. They're all genetically the same. With climate change, changes in rainfall, drought, you've got plants that all are going to respond in the same way. And everybody had plants damaged this winter by the big freeze. And so if all your plants are cultivars and they're a little more sensitive to the cold than other plants, then they're not going to make it when we have another situation like we did this winter. So by buying native plants, you've got genetic diversity. And when these plants reproduce, the gene pools mix and you have more and more genetic diversity. So we don't want to have a shallow gene pool. Here are pictures of flowers. On the left, the bottom we have a zinnia with one row of petals, and in the middle we have the stamens or the pistils. We have the part of the plant that has the pollen on it, the yellow. In the picture at the top, scientists have altered it so that a lot of those parts that produce pollen have been turned into petals. So when you've got lots of petals like you do in the top one, you don't have much benefit for wildlife. The picture on the other side is a hydrangea. The lower picture, you see you've got big blooms around the edge, and you've got these little tiny blooms that are not very pretty or showy in the center. Those are the blooms that have the nectar and the pollen. When scientists change the hydrangea so that it's all those big showy blooms, there's no nectar or pollen for the insects because they have altered the nectar and pollen producing parts of the plant. So just a little, and it's okay. You certainly don't have to put all native plants. Doug Hallamy recommends 70% of your plant material being native. So the environment can handle some of these kind of things. My sister loves to grow zinnias, and I said, well, get some of them that just have one row of petals. Purchasing plants. Most of our garden centers do not deal in native plants. You may find a few native plants, but they are going to be cultivars. It's very rare that you will see straight species native plants in your typical garden stores. Most of the cultivars are patented. It's illegal to reproduce them. You want to avoid plants that say they are not going to have insects on them because they've probably been treated and with chemicals to kill the insects. And those treatments, I've heard, can last up to 2 or 3 years on the plant. So every time a plant comes, a bee or insect comes and takes pollen or nectar from that plant, it's going to kill it. Native plant nurseries sell the straight species, but they also sell cultivars. So if you go to a native plant nursery, you still have to take a look at the plant. I personally prefer to try to find straight species of plants, because if my yard's a little wild looking, that's okay. If you live in a place with an HOA and wild looking is not okay, I'm sorry. That's a problem for a lot of people. So these are some of the brand name plants. Southern Living, Monrovia, Proven Winners. These are all always going to be cultivars because these companies can't make money just selling a regular old native plant. And they develop these, like I said before, to be showier and more interesting to the humans. They're not concerned about the insects. And you may see some kind of a trademark on the label. Native plant nurseries are the place that you're going to find native plants most frequently. And we have a couple here in the area that are on your, that last sheet I gave you, that specialize in native plants. And then there are mail order places that you can get them as well. Then I want to say one thing about keystone plants, and this is, Doug Talmy talks a lot about keystone plants. Keystone plants are the plant species that provide the most for insects and wildlife. Oak trees, cherry trees, anything in the prunus genus, which are plums and cherries, and willow trees. I didn't put that on, but native willow trees. Weeping willow trees are not native. Willow trees provide the most benefits for insects. And then in terms of flowers, goldenrod and asters provide the most benefits. So when you're putting in native plants, think about these keystone plants are very important. So gardening with native plants can produce a pleasing landscape. It's going to be different than the landscape that builders put in your yard. It's going to be different. It's not going to be maybe not as neat and tidy, and but you can be assured that it is functioning. It's a more functional landscape for our native animals. Native plants support the lives of insects, which in turn are crucial to the survival of higher life forms, of which we are one. They provide food and habitat. Learn a few of the botanical names to distinguish the native from the non-native, because this can be a real problem in purchasing plants. And then when you have a choice, choose native over non-native, and avoid buying and planting invasives. So again, we have our phones, we can look these things up and get some help on what to buy and what not to buy. Questions? Questions. Yes.
I was told once that only not native could be called invasive. If it's
That's
native,
true.
That's
If
true.
if it is a native and it acts in sort of the same way as an invasive, we use the term aggressive.
Aggressive.
Aggressive. Yes. So there is a trumpet vine, if you're familiar with that, that has these beautiful orange flowers on it. That is it's native, but it's very aggressive. My neighbor has some in her flower beds, and they take over. They're really looking for a tree to climb. And then I have a vine called cross vine, which is a native vine, and has a big yellow bloom that just recently bloomed. And the hummingbirds love it, except they say, but they're not ever here by the time it's bloomed. But it just grows all over the ground in my area, under trees and things, where that's it's okay in that situation, but it is aggressive. Yeah.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
What are your thoughts about, you were mentioning how to go over and plant more natives. What are your thoughts about planting natives along with the other plants that you have in the garden? Should you have a native plant section separate, or are they all planted?
No. You can integrate them as long as they need the same environment. So you don't want to put a native plant that needs a different environment, mix them. But yeah, it's not reasonable to think that everybody's going to tear up their yards and put in all native plants, or to even start a new space. Yeah, start a new space. Yeah. Any other questions?